Hey folks, greetings from the offensive security group at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today you've got myself, Spencer, and Darrius on the podcast. Hey, Darrius.
Hey, glad to be back.
So today and next couple episodes, we're going to be talking about our favorite thing, or at least my favorite thing, PowerShell. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about how cyber adversaries harness the power of PowerShell to orchestrate their malicious attacks in their activities. So yeah, this episode is all about how attackers use, abuse, and otherwise utilize PowerShell for their nefarious deeds. So in the next episode, we plan to talk about the opposite side, or the opposite side of the coin here, where we're going to talk about how you as a defender can use PowerShell and how you can use your security tools to detect and mitigate PowerShell attacks or attacks with PowerShell. So I'm looking forward to this next couple episodes. PowerShell is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I love, as Darrius can attest to, I talk about PowerShell all the time. I try to convert everyone to PowerShell if they're not already using PowerShell. And from an offensive perspective, it's certainly not dead. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that. PowerShell has gone away to some extent in the offensive security community because of things like script block logging, constrained language mode, and things like that. But those are all things we're going to talk about. So Darrius, I'm looking forward to this. I think this is something that we've been wanting to talk about for a while now.
Oh yeah, for sure. In fact, Spencer, it wasn't until I met you that I found someone else who loves PowerShell as much as I do. PowerShell for me, like that's honestly kind of where I got my start. Way back in the day, entry level Darius, doing sysadmin work was like, wait a second,
Yeah.
PowerShell and automating and all of that, and that's kind of where I got my start. And so yeah, no, it's PowerShell is everywhere. It's extremely powerful, and so yeah, I'm really excited for these next couple of podcasts that we're going to do.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to both the offensive discussion about PowerShell and the defensive discussion, because you and I both come from IT sysadmin backgrounds. We both come from automation and stuff like that. And PowerShell is a tremendously awesome tool, and there are things you can do with PowerShell that you would never even imagine. For example, you can create GUIs with PowerShell. Don't know if anybody knew that, but it's an extremely powerful language. It's also ubiquitous, right? And that's one of the reasons why attackers love to use PowerShell, right? Darrius, is like, you go to a modern environment, it's Windows. Most people are running Windows, and PowerShell is installed by default. The .NET framework is installed by default. And so it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. No matter where you go, you're usually going to be able to find PowerShell unless you have, removed it, uninstalled it, or hindered its ability to operate, right?
Yeah, in which case, I imagine you're getting a lot more support calls because things aren't working. It's really tough to turn PowerShell off for your entire environment.
Yep.
So,
yeah, definitely. And when we talk about kind of restricting PowerShell in the next episode and stuff, we'll talk about why that is, right? And why you can't just simply turn PowerShell off. It's going to make your IT admins hate you if you do that. But yeah, PowerShell is ubiquitous. That's one of the reasons why attackers love to use it. They know that when they drop a stage 0 or something like that, they know that they're going to be able to use, IEX or the .NET libraries to download their next stage or download their tools, stuff like that. Another reason why it's so powerful, or why attackers love using it, is because of the native integration with Windows. So when I say native integration, I mean things like being able to call .NET or use .NET libraries within PowerShell code, being able to use C# within PowerShell via like add type and stuff. So it's a very powerful language, and it integrates with Windows very nicely.
in fact, I think a lot of times what I've seen is PowerShell is kind of the gateway scripting language of what you may start with, in some cases Python, but if you go the PowerShell route, eventually you start learning more and more, and you get to more advanced topics, and then the next thing you know, you start writing stuff in C sharp.
Yep.
So, yeah, definitely agree with you about it and just how well it integrates just natively.
Yeah, and it's really cool to be able to take a C sharp program and more or less convert it into or convert it into PowerShell or use it within PowerShell using add type, um, or using things like system.reflection.assembly.
Yep.
So you can load a DLL into using PowerShell into memory. So that's pretty neat, and I use that often on pen test engagements. Doing offensive security stuff is I have a DLL or a C sharp program, and I want to load that into PowerShell. And there's multiple ways to do that, kind of out of the box. You don't need to install anything, which is really nice.
Sure.
The other integrations I wanted to mention too, where we see attackers abusing it, is with code execution and lateral movement, right? So, and we'll get into more specifics in a minute, but I just kind of touch on this point of native integration with Windows with things like invoke command. So no matter where PowerShell is, invoke command is typically going to be there. An invoke command you can use to run commands on other systems. So if I'm an IT admin and I want to run, who am I on all my servers, I can use invoke command. Or if I want to download a file, right, Darius, invoke web request.
Yep.
So there's stuff built into Windows, that we can use. That's part of the PowerShell language.
For sure. And then also, PowerShell is very beginner friendly. For those who have never touched PowerShell, just quick PowerShell 101. You have commandlets, you have modules, and then those modules have commandlets, and then those commandlets are always something along the lines of verb, noun of some sort. So, it makes sense. It's really easy to just tie things together. Invoke. Okay, there's the verb. Command. What does
Yep.
that commandlet do? It invokes a command. So it's very easy to learn and pick up, which is
Yeah.
probably another reason why you see threat actors using it.
Yep. Yeah, because not all threat actors are created equally, and some are very, very good at malware development and reversing in Windows internals, and others are script kiddies, right? They're just copy pasting code. So PowerShell, there's no compiling necessary. You can rapidly prototype, and to Darius's point, all of those things make it very easy to read, write, and understand and use. And from to kick off to wrap up this intro section of why PowerShell is a regular in most of the MITRE attack techniques and tactics, right? So whether it's recon, defense evasion, lateral movement, privilege escalation, credential access, etc., you can find PowerShell in pretty much every category.
So we can jump into, I guess, just some common attacks and things that we're doing as attackers involving PowerShell. So a lot of times, particularly with any pen test, one of the first things we're doing is, okay, we're going to do enumeration, we're going to do recon, things of that nature, and PowerShell is really good at that. In fact, in a lot of cases, I know of other people in firms, first thing when they get on the box, instead of opening up GUIs trying to collect information, PowerShell script that runs and gets you everything you need to know as far as, hey, host name, IP addresses, any file shares, just registry keys, things of that nature. PowerShell can do that, and that's definitely kind of a first step.
Yep. Yeah, and PowerShell is great because of its pipelining ability. So you can take one command, pipe it with the pipe character to another command, and then output that to a file. So yeah, it's very prevalent in recon, right? So attackers are going to use PowerShell to find files and list shares and everything that you said, Darius, too. And even when you talk about cloud, right? PowerShell, talk about Azure, Entra ID. PowerShell is the tool, right?
Yeah.
That is the administrator's tool to integrate with Graph API and all of the other tools that you would use in Azure. So PowerShell is commonly used for recon and discovery and enumeration and all that.
And you bring up a really good point, specifically about output. So I'm a huge API guy. PowerShell, you can consume APIs with PowerShell. But, I think one of the things that I personally really like is how it can handle objects and, getting large JSON objects back from an API and being able to filter things down. Just PowerShell makes it so easy. I kind of think back to, the AWS CLI, for example, where, you're getting stuff back. And if you really want to filter down, there are tons of ways to do it. A common one is using like the JQ CLI tool. But man, that is not as simple to use as
Yeah.
simply, PowerShell variable invoke rest method. I'm getting my stuff back. And at that point, variable dot, I'm drilling down, into the
Yep.
object. So, yeah, definitely it makes life
Yep.
a lot easier.
Yeah, for sure. PowerShell's converting commandlets, like convert from JSON, convert from CSV, and then also the opposite, convert to, is super awesome to create things, to convert things to an object and take them from an object to an output format like JSON, CSV, etc. is awesome. So the other area I wanted to touch on with PowerShell abuse or common ways PowerShell is abused by attackers is defense evasion. So one of the most obvious is just to disable Defender, right? So setting set MP preference is the commandlet, and there's a bunch of commandlets you can use in PowerShell that can help you administer Defender. And so you can disable real-time monitoring. You can reset or delete all the signatures, all Defender signatures. And somebody recently just posted a POC for creating a job that runs repeatedly to continuously delete Defender signatures. And they just run a set command, PowerShell commandlet to just reset those over and over and over again. And then their POC is just them running that and then running Mimikatz after that.
That's wow. Awesome.
It just continuously deletes the Defender signatures and just never has a chance to detect anything because they're all gone.
That's brilliant. I mean, it's simplicity at its best.
Yep. But that's goes back to what we were saying earlier is PowerShell's ubiquitous, right? So these Defender commandlets are just there. Whether you have Defender running or not, they're there and they're available to users to use. Now, some of this stuff requires administrative access to be able to actually execute, but nonetheless, it's there. One of my favorites, AMZ bypassing, right? If you are around the InfoSec community or offensive security at all, you've probably heard about AMZ and all of the various ways to bypass it. It's very common that when somebody creates an AMZ bypass, they either port it to PowerShell or it's created in PowerShell and then ported to other languages. And so AMZ bypasses are a very common way that PowerShell is used to kind of get around defenses. Darrius, I don't know if you have taken a stab at any of the AMZ bypass stuff that's been out there recently, but there's been I feel like every month or every week, every few months, there's like a new bypass method.
I was just gonna say, like literally this morning on Twitter, saw like, hey, new bypass. It's definitely a cat and mouse game of hey, you find an AMZ bypass, it works for however long it works, and then eventually it gets burned. But I mean, hey, by that time, there's another one that's out there. So
yep,
just part of the game.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of leads to my next point of PowerShell logging, right? This is something that we have talked about before, and we've talked to other people internally about is making sure PowerShell logging is enabled and monitoring it and stuff like that. So you can simply disable PowerShell logging with a simple PowerShell command. You can even clear the event logs, and that is a common way that attackers are going to cover their tracks.
Which hopefully, if event logs are gone, something should be firing off somewhere. I know we'll talk about that in another episode, but yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. The SOC analyst in Darrius is like fire alarms are going off. Like the event log was cleared or console history was wiped. Like, somebody please alert. Yeah. So we talked about recon. We talked about defense evasion a little bit. There are numerous examples in each of these categories, but I guess the goal of this episode is just call to light some of these things and talk about some of the ways that PowerShell is used by attackers. So execution.
This is the big one. This is the big and the fun one for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So a couple ideas come to my mind when I think about execution in terms of PowerShell is one to download additional tools. So additional attacker tools like download them to the host or load them into memory, right? Maybe I want to download and execute PowerView or something like that. So that's commonly used for that. And we also see it commonly used in various parts of an infection chain where, encoded PowerShell will be called, right, Darrius?
Yep, all the time. And I just, to really kind of like touch on something that you said that I just think is extremely important is, being able to load these binaries into memory, like really changed the game. I look back to like, a couple of years ago and, granted EDR solutions have caught up by now. They've definitely improved, but man, years ago, once you loaded something into memory, like that was it. You've won. And as far as like detection goes, there was none. It never touched the disk. And
Yep.
so, PowerShell, I think definitely played a huge hand in kind of the rise of fileless malware and even the rise of like, using some of the other services that are just native to Windows to kind of
Yep.
hide and cover your tracks. PowerShell is a huge part of that.
Yep. PowerShell is a lol bin, right? It's a living off the land binary, as are many other things. And PowerView was created in part to call attention to fileless malware attacks, right? And when we say fileless, we think PowerShell, VBA, JScript, right? VBA macros, right? Macros in for VBA. So many things you can encompass into fileless now that AMZ is now detecting, right? So AMZ is when it was first introduced, it was all right, and it's gotten better over the years, and it continues to get better. But AMZ, as we'll talk about in the defensive episode, is there to help prevent fileless attacks or to detect them. So PowerShell is commonly abused to, like you said, Darrius, load stuff into memory, not touch disk, and just execute it. And we see this all the time with, initial like droppers. So, maybe there's a phishing email that comes through. It's got a malicious Word document attached to it, right? And it's got a mail doc in it that downloads an additional batch file, and then that batch file runs, some process, or maybe it runs PowerShell, and maybe it calls or runs an encoded PowerShell command, right? So people are probably familiar with that, have seen it, where there's a whole bunch of like base64 encoded stuff, right? That you've seen, and it's encoded PowerShell, and it downloads additional stuff, and then it does some other stuff. That is very common in an infection chain. So that we see that very often.
So aside from execution, next, just, once again, PowerShell can be used at every single phase of the process. That's just how flexible it is. But, persistence, PowerShell can help with that in terms of, you can create scheduled tasks. You can get all the scheduled tasks and, depending on how things are, you can modify them. I think one that, back during my analyst days we saw a lot of was you would modify the registry where okay we're going to modify a registry key and we're basically going to put some bytecode or the key in the registry, and then now boom, now that we're running things in memory, we're going to grab this, we're going to BOR it, and then boom, execute it.
Yep.
So that's definitely a way of persistence, and something that you often see threat actors use.
Yep. And it's something I didn't mention in some of these categories is kind of how I use this stuff on engagements. And persistence, I don't commonly execute persistence on penetration tests because it's not as necessary as something like a red team. But I do have PowerShell scripts that I've wrote to find privilege escalation opportunities within like scheduled tasks. So if the scheduled task, scheduled tasks, for those that don't know, are susceptible to unquoted paths, just kind of the same way services are. So, I have PowerShell scripts that will enumerate a host and look for, scheduled tasks that I can abuse, look for services that I can abuse. So that falls into the execution category and recon and discovery of finding misconfigurations and exploiting them. And persistence, like you said, is one of those things where we can use PowerShell to find vulnerable scheduled tasks. We can use PowerShell to configure scheduled tasks and run them. Modifying the registry is another example, like you said, in creating accounts, right? There's built-in commandlets in PowerShell that are pretty much everywhere you go on a Windows box to create new accounts, to add members to the local admins group, and those are just built in to Windows through those PowerShell commandlets. So, like you said, Darrius, it gets to be redundant, I feel like, at this point, where we keep saying the same thing over and over again in the context of, PowerShell is ubiquitous. But, I mean, PowerShell is ubiquitous, right? It's what it is. You can use it everywhere. It's so pervasive. It allows you to do so many different things. And one of the reasons why I love using it for pen tests, for purple teams, for offensive security engagements in general. So, lateral movement. This is the last kind of category that I have on the list here. This is something that is very common as well for attackers. For us on pen tests is PowerShell remoting. PowerShell remoting is an awesome utility. Invoke command is part of that as well, but also something you might have heard of as new PS session. This is something I like to do sometimes as well when I don't want to, drop PS exec, or I don't want to use a remote service or something like that myself, and I'll just use PS session, right? PS remoting to remote to a system that I have admin rights on.
And I think it's something to me that's kind of interesting is, that's the type of stuff that I used to do back in my sysadmin days is, hey, new PS session or enter PS session to manage this other box somewhere. And, now on the other side of it, it's like, yeah, of course, which is, once again, that's one of those sysadmin things that can be exploited and used for, nefarious purposes.
Yeah, definitely. And, to your point, that's another reason that I didn't have on my list for using PowerShell is it blends in, right? If you have console access to a host, or you're doing a pen test and you're able to, RDP in, or you've got initial access through like RD Gateway or Citrix or something, right? If you have admin access on a machine, rather than, doing the traditional attacker thing and using like PS exec or some custom service, or, executing a Cobalt Strike beacon or something like that, that's going to get probably caught, just using built-in Windows, lol bins, right? Living off the land again, may help you blend in a bit better, right? So PowerShell, be that it's ubiquitous, can help attackers blend in, and maybe you as a defender aren't able to detect that as easily.
For sure. I think it's kind of interesting. I remember there was one engagement we worked on where I think we were actually trying to chain some of this together. Where I think we popped a SQL Server and there was XP command shell enabled, and now we're trying. We're like, all right, let's go from XP command shell to running PowerShell to maybe let's enter a new PS session on a whole completely different service. So
that was interesting, right? It's like, so we found I think we found SQL creds somewhere on a file share.
Yep.
And then we used a tool called PowerUp SQL to or we PS remoted to the machine. I think it must have been admin creds on a server. We PS remoted to that server. I think we patched AMZ. We loaded PowerUp SQL, which is a PowerShell utility for SQL abuse. So with that PowerUp SQL tool, it was written in PowerShell, we're able to run XP command shell and run commands on the SQL server as SA, as the built-in SA account. And then, we're doing, we ended up getting like MS SQL service account, right? So the SQL database was running as that service account. And you can use a potato exploit, it's called, to elevate that SQL service account to sysadmin or system rather. So that was a fun one, and you kind of have to get coding and escaping right and all that stuff. But that was all done through a PowerShell remoting session.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm misremembering some of the details, but I think that was the gist of it. And regardless, again, all PowerShell, from the tool that we used, patching AMZ to PS remoting. The only thing that wasn't was the potato exploit. I think that was like written in C#, which is pretty much PowerShell.
Yeah, they're still tightly coupled together. So I guess the biggest takeaway from this episode is PowerShell is amazing. If you're in just the IT or cybersecurity space in general, you should learn PowerShell. I mean, you're going to benefit from it, whether it's, hey, now you can automate your stuff and not tell anybody and everybody thinks you're a rock star, or whether it's, you doing things offensively or, defensively. Like, it just, learn PowerShell. You're going to do yourself a great service if you do.
Yeah, another episode we could do that's on the offensive side is kind of how I use PowerShell, or how offensive security people use PowerShell or may use PowerShell for automating or developing tooling of their own, right? So that's another aspect of this we didn't necessarily cover. As this episode was all about how attackers are going to use and abuse PowerShell in your environment. There's another aspect of PowerShell where I'm using it to write scripts for enumeration, which we touched on a little bit. I'm using it to develop full-fledged tools. I'm using it to automate some of my tooling and stuff like that. So there's that whole other aspect of it from like a development automation standpoint that we could talk about as well. And then, of course, the same thing for the defensive side, right? It's using it as an admin and then using it as a developer and automation and all those things.
Yep.
So good. So that's all the time we have for you today. We hope you like this episode. Hope you got value from it. Hope you were interested, and if you stayed to the end to hear about all the ways that PowerShell is commonly used by attackers, we appreciate it. Appreciate you listening to us nerd out, talk about PowerShell. If you enjoy this episode, definitely give us a follow on social media. Check us out on offsec.blog or at secureIT360.com, and we will see you next Wednesday.